and just say go or something. I don't know.
Okay, you are recording this meeting. Be sure to let everyone know that they are being recorded. All right, go.
So our presentation is on early American bodies creating race, sex, and beauty. We are the Dragon Group, and Steph is going to start us off.
In Early American Bodies, Creating Race, Sex, and Beauty, Sharon Block talks about how European descendants are described in more detail than African descendants. For example, European descended men are described on basic physical features like height, eye color, and features marked on their bodies by life experience or reflected their character. European descended women were more likely to be described than African descended women in most areas, including complexion, body type, hair, eyes, character, face, skin, height, facial features, and speaking patterns. Also, the wanted poster is another example that shows how in-depth a white man was described. Um, Block also talks about how red, black, and white had different meanings back then than they do now. And Block says how the term beauty was only referring to white women. African women were almost never called or described using beauty. And this article gives an insight on how early Americans viewed bodies based on foundations of sexual and racial regulation.
So I'm just gonna kind of reiterate on some of the stuff that Steph says. The author of this article, Block, she challenges the idea that skin color was a reliable signifier of difference in early America, and that descriptors were more or less dependent on race and sex. Physical descriptors were the norm used to describe people's social statuses in their lives, and for example, that could be like a man could be described by his eye color as opposed to being white. The terms black, white, and red did not have the same racial meaning that they do now. White, in particular, was actually used to describe people that looked sickly or pale. And an example of descriptors depending on race was the aforementioned beauty example, where white women beauty was only referring to white women and never to African American women. Another example in particular is that black people usually did not have last names, whereas white people did.
So black and white was non-binary throughout much of history. There have been many descriptions of people of color. Descriptions of early Americans, white men were described in the most detail, focusing on their basic physical feature like eye color, height, etc. White women were described in far less detail than men, but they were described more than those of African descent. Although racial descriptors appeared more than anything else, so things like Irish or Negro or mulatto or German, Irish, obviously Negro and mulatto, of course, being less exact, less precise than German or English to describe white people. Yellow was also becoming a more commonly used way to describe mixed European and African people, which may have come from the Galenic perspective of the body, yellow bile, of course, being one of the four humors, which is demonstrated on the right here in this diagram. Yellow was closely related to those of hot and dry climates, which would be people of African descent. But yellow was not the choice descriptor for colonial Americans, and neither was white. More popular were things like fair, fairish, dark, darkish, light, lightish. White was never really used to describe complexion. As Matt said, white was used in more of a derogatory way, being a term used to describe those who look sickly or something that isn't inborn. In particular, it was used to describe mulattoes, people of mixed African and white heritage.
Scars and other marks showed the occupation. Those with marks were seen as more malleable than those without them. It kind of described life experience and, quote, innate character traits. The missing teeth of African-descended men were mentioned twice as much as African-descended women, and quote, suggesting that the writers made gender-influenced choices in runaway descriptions. Slaves were described by whippings, servants by their hard-lived lives, and free people almost never were described in such a manner. Women's bodies didn't have as much to do with the public discourse as the appearance of them did. Beauty was also more so closely associated with social status, race, or whiteness, and other factors as to how somebody actually looked. Men's bodies were described in more detail as was mentioned before, by eye color and all that. And women's bodies, not as much.
So just to wrap it up, Bloch's thesis is essentially by understanding how early Americans saw the bodies on which they based these foundations of sexual and racial regulation, we can better trace why particular sex-related constructs could be easily naturalized as based in presumed realities of the body. So basically, if we can understand how they viewed the body, then we can understand how they viewed sex and race. Views of the body have evolved over time, as we have discussed, and that the evolution of beauty has transformed more from a social status and less physical to more physical attributes that we consider quote unquote beautiful. Views on race as color, on color as descriptors have also changed. How we use the term, white, black, and so on to describe people. Gender and race are related but different. We see how the disparity between white men and white women, and white men and women versus people of African descent, and that again, that beauty was not a term ever used to describe African Americans, and that is the article. Did you stop recording?